So welcome to our monthly speaker series. I have the pleasure to welcome Sarah London. She's our chapter's former president. She was the youngest president and the first female in 15 years. She'll be giving a talk on the psychological aspect of performance and being authentic. She has a master's degree in psychology from NYU. She's a former figure model, and she's currently a freelance writer. So again, thank you very much for appearing today, and let's give her a round of applause.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. First off, thank you to everybody who has shown up. This means a lot to me. It is one of my dreams in life to give a lecture, and I did not imagine that it would go this way, but I'm very thankful that it has. And thank you so much to Greater New York Mensa for sponsoring this and giving me a platform to fulfill one of my dreams in life. So let's get started. Coming into being, the psychology of performing as yourself. In the modern age, as technology has become a cornerstone of socialization, work-obsessed lifestyles are a la mode, and public activism is enmeshed with private life, performance and authenticity have become almost indistinguishable. What does it mean to perform in one's role or in one's life? And does that mean then that someone is inauthentic? Over the next, 45 minutes maybe, I should have timed it better, we're going to take a psychoanalytic look at how recognizing performance, genuine or otherwise, can help lead to a more insightful and stable sense of self. First, let me introduce myself. I know Dave gave you the little quick and dirty, but I'll give you a more detailed bio. I'm an author, academic, and Manhattan resident. I earned my master's degree in an individualized psychology intensive at NYU's Gallatin School, getting various certificates along the way from places like Harvard Business School and the National Council for Behavioral Health. I'm currently freelance journalist, consultant, and novelist. I write mostly for a business news website called Ladders News and a music magazine called Riff Mag. I've also worked in the art world as a live model for drawing and painting and sculpture. And as Dave said, I am the former president of Greater New York Mensa. Probably the most importantly of all these things is that I've written a book to be published later this year about the identity and performance of the psychoanalyst. But seeing as it's a very dense topic, and I imagine many of you out there are not like psychoanalysts, this is a much more layman's version of the very same ideas. However, if you are in the mental health field, my future work might also be of interest to you. So this talk is going to be structured in a pretty linear way because we're covering a lot of really intellectually dense material, and keeping it all organized is the best way to digest it. So the first thing we're going to do is define performance. Then we're going to define authenticity, colloquially for both, just what it means in the real world, like what it might mean to you. Then we're going to identify performance in a psychoanalytic way. You might be familiar with psychoanalysis as the teachings of Sigmund Freud and his followers, but while his theories are kind of the foundation for a lot of other theorists, we're going to be talking more about the latter than we are about Freud himself. Then we're going to define what authenticity might look like in the context of all that theory, and perhaps how to get there. So first off, what is performance? When you think of performance, right, you just think about getting up on a stage or something, actually performing a role as an actor would. So when you think of a performer, classically, it's defined in terms of the performing arts. This can come in the form of acting or dancing or singing or anything of the like, something where the subject takes on another role, hopefully to entertain the audience that's perceiving them. It's difficult to definitively say the purpose of the performing arts, as I'm sure many artists and art lovers would argue about. Performance can exist to entrance and enthrall the audience, but it can also exist to be provocative, make them think, or it can exist to completely distract from the outside world at hand. Maybe some would say it exists for all those reasons and more. Performance is usually pretty immersive, like it takes place in a theater or concert hall, and it lasts for a duration of time, much like this lecture, after which the performer goes back to being a pumpkin or a real person. And the performance involves a certain set of aesthetic parameters. The performer looks a certain way, perhaps in a costume, and the audience looks a certain way as well, hopefully not like wearing jeans to the opera or anything. The other main way in which to begin thinking about performance is not necessarily as this distanced, removed thing that happens on a stage in front of you. Another word you hear thrown around a lot these days, another way we understand performance in contemporary life is performativity, right? Saying like, oh, that's so performative, or something like performative activism. If you don't really run in those circles where the word performative is thrown around a lot, I can tell you what it means right now. as opposed to a performance in which one assumes another role to present to an audience, a role that's not you, a role that encompasses a different character or an altered version of oneself, like a comedian. Performativity occurs in everyday life, off of a stage. So in the world of academia, the history of performativity began with language. The philosopher John L. Austin crafted the term performativity and referred it as the art of performing language. So imagine saying something that you're doing in real time, like saying I do at a wedding, or I promise, because you're executing an action. That's performativity. In modern theory, gender theorist Judith Butler redefined the term performativity as the act of assuming a societal role. In her case, that was gender. So think about, gender stereotypes that we're all raised with. Boys like blue, girls like pink, boys like trucks, or girls like dolls. We like these things, according to Butler, because we're told that they're things that people in our gender should also like, for better or for worse, or for no value judgment at all. This is the gender performativity that Butler argues exists for everybody, as opposed to sex, which you have assigned at birth. Gender isn't something you inherently are, it's just something that you do. This theory has been further extrapolated in the Common Era to include not just gender, but all sorts of social actions by anthropologists the world over. The term performativity, taught in things like anthropology or sociology courses, has turned into something of a colloquially used academic reference point. Let's go back to performative activism. Here, performance is used as kind of a put down, talking about a situation in which you're acting like you're really invested in social issues or civil rights, but you're really just doing it because of the external pressures that you face. Companies are accused of performative activism for using social justice slogans in their advertisements, and individuals are accused of performative activism by stating their interest in civil rights on various social media platforms, but neglecting to support civil rights causes in a more substantial way. You might have heard of this as like slacktivism, right? But performativity can swing the other way too. Like your crazy uncle who annexes family dinners with conversations about QAnon might be tempted to very dogmatically assert his opinions because of a deep-seated fear of those in society seeing anything less than complete obstinacy as like siding with the liberal snowflakes. So now that we have a sense of how performance is thought of and executed, both on stage and off stage, we have to determine what authenticity is, like outside of a psychological context, just what the average person on the street would consider authentic if you asked anyone. So let's start simply. Authenticity is defined in Merriam-Webster as the act of being authentic, which is a great start, but like doesn't answer a lot of questions. We look up synonyms. We get genuineness, realness, reliability, trustworthiness. That doesn't seem to help much either, as these are all just like words, not explanations of the concept. Someone like Sartre might define authenticity as the ability to exercise one's free will, or Kierkegaard might define authenticity as the ability to cast off the shackles of materialism and start believing in your God-driven internal compass. But how authenticity is defined colloquially outside of the academic world, it seems like it might be quite a bit less esoteric, as we kind of see it everywhere. Like, you Google authenticity, right? You get books like The Authenticity Project, which is a real book, articles like How to Be Your Authentic Self or Becoming a More Authentic Person, How to Be Authentic, 12 Easy Steps. Maybe it's just me, but that seems kind of counterintuitive. Like if authenticity is like genuineness or realness, how can one person tell another how to be real? Isn't it like subjective? It depends on personality, experience, emotions, internal conflict. Isn't that naturally what authenticity is the sum of your whole real self? There's this fad now, it seems, it's like insidiously worked into society, originating from these really elaborate self-help lectures of the 1970s, like guys like Eckhart Tolle, led to Tony Robbins, or I don't know, Deepak Chopra. And now we get inspirational memes and TikToks and motivational talks at business luncheons, like TED Talks where some neuroscience PhD tells you about how to overcome those mean neurotransmitters and keeping you down from becoming your real self or something. But what does that mean? What does any of that mean? What exactly do you think of when you think of an authentic person? Is it someone who dresses how they want, who acts how they want? One of those people who says, I don't care what anybody says, I see my mind no matter what. Or someone who claims to be at peace with themselves enough to let things wash over them, stoically claiming to feel nothing in the face of something irritating or obnoxious. Is there a universal measure of authenticity, of how you and everyone else can be real? When you think of authenticity, do you think of a friend, a relative, maybe even yourself? So now we have this kind of vague idea of what self and performance is. We can begin to think about how it happens, the mechanisms of how one performs psychologically. What makes someone want to act like they're not? And what makes you want to shield your authenticity from the world? Here we're going to take a look at 3 psychoanalytic theorists that examine this internal and external dynamic in different ways. I'm sure at least most of you have heard of the idea of psychoanalysis, the field of psychology founded by mother lover Sigmund Freud, and maybe you even have some ideas about what it means or who Freud was. The thinkers we're going to explore today were either direct disciples of his or tertiary disciples, some of whom disagreed with him a lot. You know, that's something I always loved about psychoanalysis. It's like it's essentially invented by one dude and then followed by a bunch of other people who proceeded to argue with him about pretty much everything he said. It's like the epicenter of discourse, like Grand Central Station for how ideas about how the human psyche work. So the 3 theorists we're going to use as examples are of course I would get this part mixed up, Carl Jung, Karen Horney, and D.W. Winnicott. We essentially have this framework, these guys, right, of external and internal, one's inner self and the performance of oneself at emergent psychoanalytic thinking. Here, we see the outer self, as I'll probably refer to it in the future, as synonymous with performance, and the inner self as synonymous with authentic. These are just examples, again, as they love to argue. So if you're really interested in this stuff, there's like 100 other theorists out there with different opinions on how the inner and outer selves manifest. Like the fancy journals cost money, but Google is free if this stuff interests you. Our first theorist, the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, had quite a bit to say about roles and performance. You might be familiar with him as the creator of archetypes, or if you're into personality tests, his name might sound familiar as the inspiration for the Myers-Briggs personality inventory. Jung had a fascination with the self's presentation, how it becomes whole, how it integrates and distinguishes itself from the noisy outside world. And when one's internal sense of self is unformed, the individual identifies more with the collective unconscious, which is the Jungian term for our collective memories and unconscious experiences. To Jung, these were patterns and images that appear to everyone throughout their lives and connect everyone on Earth. So we have the collective unconscious and we have the individual unconscious, which exists in your mind, and they're linked up. It's like the local roads versus the big highways. Go on the local roads, take the highway where everyone else is. There are 4 major archetypes in the individual unconscious, which is the local roads in your own head, which is all your own. And it links to the collective unconscious in this giant highway sense. But we're going to talk about 2 aspects of the archetypes of the individual unconscious here, the persona and the self. The word persona is a derivation of the word for masks worn by actors in ancient Greece to indicate whichever role they were playing. This sometimes very opinionated or aggressive character-like presentation of confidence, in the words of Jung, quote, feigns individuality, making others and oneself believe that one is individual. One is simply acting a role through which the collective psyche speaks, end quote. The persona has like no marked agenda, just as the superego has no marked agenda, or the id has no marked agenda. These things don't exist to make your life worse. They simply exist. Ultimately, one with an unformed sense of self relies too heavily on the persona, which comprise ideas and notions of what they imagine themselves to be without putting much thought into who they actually are. The persona, as Jung says, quote, consists of the sum of psychic facts that are felt to be personal, but it's only really an internalized reflection of what they've assumed their societal role to be. After a while, if one begins to rely on this persona as a means of defining their sense of self, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, the trajectory of the collective unconscious begins to form the destiny of the individual. The goal instead, to Jung, is to acknowledge and live alongside the persona using individuation, allowing your persona to become a realistic mirror of your true self, integrating one's personality while also retaining their collective psychic position. So this might seem really heady and theoretical, and believe me, it is. So here's a more practical example. Let's say you're a doctor, and when you put on the white coat and the stethoscope and the weird mirror head thing, you take not only on your doctor persona, but the philosophical, psychological, and to Jung, even the spiritual ideas of what society history, and ancestry, and the world around you conceives to be a doctor. Usually, you think that you take off the doctor coat when you leave the office and go back to first name instead of doctor last name. Now imagine you get home, you walk in the door, kick off your shoes, peek in the kitchen, wife's making meatloaf again, but you keep your little doctor outfit on. You keep it on when you watch the Raiders on Monday Night Football. You keep it on in the shower. You keep it on when you go to bed. You never take it off. You have the ideas, expectations, historical and metaphysical weight of your doctorness on you at all times. You never stop being a doctor. It's in everything you do. And that's what a persona is. It's a self that relies too much on the persona. Metaphorically, it never takes the lab coat off. It's their whole identity, their responses to the world around them and their feelings about the people in their lives. But this isn't how one is intended to live. In an ideal world, a well-integrated persona would be someone who could put on their white coat in the office, take it off when they get home, and are still able to help out in an emergency or get all the medical questions right on Jeopardy or something. And lucky for us, there's a particular way to achieve that, according to Jung. If you're having a problem integrating your persona, in therapy, one's goal would be to deconstruct your persona and rebuild it from there in a process called individuation, which I think I mentioned earlier, making yourself an individual apart from the persona. Reintegration is when aspects of the persona that don't impinge upon or contradict your real self are assimilated into your personality and evolve into methods of communicating who you are and how you fit in with the outside world. Aspects of the persona that just don't jive with the realized self are thrown right in the psychic garbage. Check with your local spiritual municipality as to when trash day is. I think it's different in every zip code. I thought that was funny. Some say that Jung's own speculations regarding personas were markedly negative, and that he saw them much like philosopher Søren Kierkegaard did, that one's presentation to the world can end up bogging down one's individuality. And in order to differentiate oneself from others, one must break away from the majority without living in fear of introspection. But that's not the whole picture. In excess in most any direction, things can become destructive, and personas aren't exempt from that scrutiny. Once deconstructed and examined, rather than relied on out of habit, a persona can be a useful tool to protect the ego. It's just a matter of correctly reforming the persona after it's been called into question, and there are a few ways that reintegration process can go awry. While the persona is necessary to communicate with others, it also assists to guard vulnerabilities in the true self. It's something of a mediator or an agent of compromise that liaisons with the true self and the outside world. Without it, the ego is not only defenseless and exposed, but one's position in relating to society becomes compromised. Imagine everyone you ever knew, like at work or at home or at line in the grocery store, saw your innermost drives and vulnerabilities. That's not the ideal, especially when some of those things can be really sensitive or difficult to talk about. So whether it's a compromise formation, as my people call it, or a protective shield, the persona plays a vital role in understanding the ego's relationship to the outside world. To disavow the collective psyche or the collective unconscious in that way is called regressive restoration. It leads to reintegration of a persona that isn't fully yours, as you never really learned who you were in the first place. You're more than your vulnerabilities, and the persona assists in facilitating that realization. Just as well, one should not attempt to live without a persona at all, lest they become completely unhinged. Jung, in a somewhat romantic gesture, calls them hopeless dreamers destined to be eternally misunderstood, as they have no connection to the collective unconscious and consequently no way to relate to anyone else, to history, to their ancestry, to their archetypes, or anything really outside themselves. It sounds a little like someone with narcissism, but it also sounds a little like a 19th century poet. Unfortunately, neither are very happy. Lastly, once you've broken down the persona, what it means to you, who your true self is, and you've reintegrated both, you'll come to realize that there's a constant maintenance you need to do in order to keep all these aspects in line. Issues arise not only in the restoration of the persona once broken down, but in the balance of one's internal and external states. When one's persona becomes unbalanced, one becomes dependent on these internalized expectations to determine their behavior, thoughts, and feelings. You need to keep checking with yourself if you want to maintain balance and retain your sense of self. I know that was a lot at once, so let me give you the cliff notes. Persona, mask. Mask, protect the vulnerable parts of yourself. Sometimes you wear a mask that isn't right for you, and you try to mold your personality around it, causing you to protect you from ever knowing who you really are. So repaint the mask or take it off sometimes, learn what it means to you, and learn how to live with it. Easy enough, right? Now let's get into the weeds. Now that you have the background of how to think about some of these ideas and how analysis begins to see the internal and external selves, or the internal authentic, external performative selves, we're going to take it a step further with analyst and proto-feminist Karen Horney's theory of the real self and the ideal self. The real versus ideal selves are far less exempt of value judgments, as one is a negative self-concept and the other is the ideal. And no, it's not the one you might think. The ideal self, unlike the persona, is a series of perceptions about yourself that perpetuate really toxic, unhelpful undercurrents in your inner lives. You live in a world where you're so consumed with the perfect image of yourself that you've crafted in your head, one that you either think you've achieved, think you could achieve, or think the world is holding back from you. Don't think of this version of yourself as having goals or aspirations, as those are perfectly healthy for one to have in life. Think of the idealized self as one that's so unachievable, you don't know yourself from your delusions. Like, I'm 4'5", but I could win a world's tallest man contest. Or my parents adopted 3 Black kids when I was a teenager. So even though I was born white, I identify as Black. That's Rachel Dolezal. This contrasts with the real self. It has characteristics most authentic to one's true wants, needs, and internal compass. While it's kind of hard to identify what real is in terms of what you want or feel, all it takes is a lot of introspection, a decent amount of time, and a really great analyst to figure out things you crave. But in many cases, the idealized self is adored, while the real self is ignored. Horney states that, quote, the central inner conflict is one between the constructive forces of the real self and the obstructive forces of the pride system, end quote. This causes tension between growth in a thoughtful, healthy way that nurtures the real self and one's ambition to prove that they really are, in fact, their perfect idealized selves, is nobody likes to be a quitter or admit that they're not perfect. Well, this might seem like predominantly internal notions that kind of roll around in your head without making contact with the outside world. The patient's idealized self emerges in their actions in unconscious and sometimes really unfortunate ways. In particular, the idealized self presents, in Horney's words, quote, the tendency to experience internal processes as if they occurred outside oneself, called externalization. As a result, one then regards external forces as being responsible for one's issues. A good example would be, say, someone who's biking down First Avenue isn't looking where they're going, and they're going the wrong way down the street, and suddenly they have to skid to a stop to avoid an oncoming car. They proceed to curse out the driver, ranting about how the whole world hates bikers, blah, blah, blah. The conflict is externalized, leaving them blind to their own role in it. It's a combination of their entitlement and thinking they could bike the wrong way down the street and face no repercussions, and the other cars who had the right of way, but they should have altered their route to avoid the biker anyway. Think about the contemporary notion of Karens. Yeah, I know I already opened and used the item, but I didn't like it, so I want to speak to the manager and get a full refund and a sincere apology. The Karen is the ultimate idealized self, because under that grandiose, entitled exterior, there could be a lot of internal conflict. The last theorist to briefly touch on in this section, but not the least, as he's my personal favorite, is also inclusive of a loosely related Jungian lens, child psychoanalyst and sweet little angel D.W. Winnicott. His true and false self theory operates in a way that's parallel to Horney's, and though they came from distinctively varied places in terms of developmental nature of their arguments, for this lecture, it's neither here nor there. Their theories are adjacent. The false self, much like the persona, describes how one presents in a social situation and how that portion of themselves operates as a guardian of the true self. But rather than Jung's personas, which exist almost in a psychic realm of their own, both the idealized self and the false self are internally juggled concepts. They only really exist inside your own personal psyche, and they're crafted based on your own experience, emotions, and trauma. While the false self protects the true self, the relationship isn't really as cut and dry as good and evil or spiritual and personal. The false self can range from a cordial dinner party presentation of who you are to a completely split off, depersonalized actor. In the worst case scenario, one uses this false self presentation to neglect their own needs and instead simply be the person others believe that they should be in any given situation in a way that's harmful to the understanding of themselves. Like Jung, Winnicott's view of the self is about assimilation and ego protection. So while Horney's idealized self, the self you fool yourself into thinking you could be, must be shrunken down and kind of cast aside, Winnicott's false self, the actor that you are in the world to protect the vulnerability of your true self, must be assessed and then integrated like the persona. So now we know how we perform, at least in this perspective of these three psychoanalytic thinkers. And after hearing all that, you might be taking a minute, or you zoned out during the densest parts of that entire diatribe, to think about yourself. So let's process what we just heard. There are a few overarching themes in these three examples, and God help me if any psychoanalyst hears me say that, as they can often be very prickly about comparing and contrasting across the theoretical aisle. One of the most prominent that you'll recognize is that there's always this inner self, who in this situation we compare it to authenticity, and the outer self, the performative self. Whether the outer self is an actor, an unattainable version of your self-concept, or an embodiment of some greater force, it always serves a purpose: to keep prying eyes from seeing the inner self, which is often sensitive, delicate, and vulnerable. That's for the most part the way it is in analytic theory. We also know that in order to meld this outer self with your inner self, you need to take apart what your outer self means and start to think critically about it. But what if you take apart that outer self and your inner self is exposed and you don't know what to do with it because you don't know what it is? Like, imagine breaking apart a jelly-filled donut without knowing that it was jelly-filled or what flavor it was filled with. Kind of a surprise, right? Some might even say an unwelcome surprise if you're wearing a white shirt. But you should probably know what kind of jelly filling it is or what flavor is in it. If you're here at this talk anyway, it operates without saying you're the kind of person who's interested in figuring out the filling flavor. So what we're gonna do now is figure out what the inner self, or authenticity, really is. Authenticity, at least by analytic standards, isn't super explicit. If by authenticity, one is talking about the things someone wants, why they want them, the closest we can get there is something called drives. Drive theory classically operates under the assumption that everyone is either motivated towards eros, which is sex or life, or thanatos, death or aggression, which is a bit old school and kind of polarizing theory. And if you're not talking about it in terms of drive theory, authenticity can also be defined differently by different theoretical orientations of analysis. Honestly, if you're a therapist or researcher, unless you're a therapist or researcher, I find it kind of unhelpful to try and parse out this very complicated analytic jargon about authenticity. It's just not productive for laymen to try and figure out. A more accessible way to start thinking about what authenticity means is one word: why. Why you feel one way, why you think about things in another way, why you like this or why you don't like that. All these motives are present in every single thing you do. I'll put it this way. Performance artist Kathy Change believed that her self-immolation was a physical representation of the transformation she believed should occur in the political structure of the United States. The performance of setting herself on fire is fueled by the lighter fluid of authentic rage, sadness, grief, and hopelessness. And it's those motives which cause her to strike a match. This is a pretty easy conceptualization with which to think about being authentic, that you set yourself ablaze with the presentation of the false self or the persona, whatever it might be that day, while allowing the lighter fluid of your emotions to fuel those flames. The difference between someone who has too many or too few boundaries versus someone who has just the right amount is the level of control they have over that lighter fluid. You could be running on a full tank of anger, but with a careful hand and a delicate touch, your flames could end up just hot enough to get your authentic self across without starting a forest fire. That being said, the first thing to really note about authenticity is that we often live in shades of gray rather than black and white. And as a result, performance does not definitively equate to inauthenticity. I'll say it again, because it's an important one. Performance does not definitively equate to inauthenticity. So don't think of them as opposites, or that there are two parts of yourself that exist independently of each other. You can always find pointers as to who your true self might be in the ways that you choose to perform. In a definition of authenticity comparable to that of Rousseau's, the source within guides the authentic path. And sometimes that source can communicate through the persona or the false self or even the idealized self. Sure, performance can be inauthentic, as without insight and connection to your internal wishes and desires, one can unfortunately bite into the crunchy crab cake of their behaviors only to find imitation crab meat inside. However, performance is about one's relationship to how they're seen in the world, whether that embodies realistic or unrealistic parts of their personalities. So that's, I guess, somewhere to start. There are times I find myself performing throughout the day. Are there things I enjoy about that performance? Do I like them because I wish I were more like that? Or do I enjoy them because it feels like there's a little glimmer of who I am poking through this usually very sterile exterior? While some performances can be nonverbal, like dressing a certain way, sitting a certain way on the subway, wearing your hair however you do, a lot of times you perform by communicating, another piece of the authenticity puzzle. These communications can be anything from telling your coworker you like their shirt, to reacting to a significant other crying at a sad movie, to a desperate housewife on reality TV throwing their drink at someone. The ball's in your court to determine if consoling someone at the end of Titanic or throwing your gin and tonic on their Birkin is a part of yourself that performs an emotion rather than expressing how you truly feel. And yes, there is a difference. It could be that you would rather the other person not take your feelings seriously. So you put on this big show of relaying them, indulging the idealized self by unconsciously saying, look how much control I have over my emotions. I can make you believe that I'm out of control. It could be that you look back at an interaction and feel really badly about how it went. That can be an indicator as well. Whether you're performing as a meek person, an aggressive person, maybe a confused person or a supplicant person. In the Winnicottian false self sense, you were trying to be what you believed the other person wanted you to be, perhaps to keep from saying what you really felt. For whatever reason, that's the first thing to keep in mind. That communication is an important facet to determine authenticity. Next, even if lines between performance and authenticity can be blurry, authenticity is not something that's determined entirely by one party. It is ultimately in the eyes of the co-constructors, meaning that all parties have a say as to whether or not an interaction is genuine. And one of the keys to determining whether you're being authentic in a situation is to read the room, find out who you're talking to, how to relay what you're thinking and feeling in a way that indicates your personal communication style, your emotional level, your general personality, whatever it is. Authenticity isn't about hitting someone when you're mad or going on a bender when you're really upset. And it isn't catering your language so specifically that you're neglecting to tell the other party how you feel, even if it means you laugh or cry or show really strong emotion. This aspect of authenticity is about empathy, which here I define as the ability to understand a situation through somebody else's eyes. So going back to the drink throwing, right? The person on the other end of your drink might see your anger and pain, which are real emotions to you in the moment, but see the way you're acting out and think, you can't be serious. Like, why are you hamming it up like this? Maybe your idealized self would say, screw you, I'm not hamming it up. This is who I really am. But if you take a moment to empathize with the other party, to really understand how and why they might be pointing out this issue, you might be able to learn a little more about yourself. It's up to you whether you hear the other person when they say that and think to yourself, geez, is that really me? Without getting defensive or mad. You might think you know yourself better than anyone, but you might not know how you come off. In some ways, the people around you know you and understand you on a wavelength more humanistic than either of you realize. If you let people attempt to understand you, it doesn't matter whether it's a correct or incorrect understanding. It doesn't even matter if the other person sees you in the context of their own idealized or false selves. In your newfound curiosity, you could open the door to possibility as to who you could be, how you could feel, and how you could communicate all those feelings. The last thing, and believe me, this is truly not the last aspect of authenticity, but we only have so much time here, is that authenticity is not just about finding your own way to communicate with others or connect with others. It's about finding a way to communicate and connect with yourself. You might be trying to not only convince others around you that you're a certain way, but convince yourself you're the same way. Like, you want to be snarky, so you act snarky. You want to be fashionable, so you dress fashionably. You want to be nice, so you act nice. All to prove to yourself that, yes, you are that kind of person. That's generally the idealized self-talking. You wish you were more like something, so you start acting like it. And it could be something that seems harmless, like wanting to copy someone else's haircut, or something that seems really harmful, like wanting to copy someone else's substance abuse. but it generally stems from a place of dissatisfaction. And if you find yourself getting defensive about these aspects of your personality, that could be a hint that there's something more to be explored there. So anyway, it is as simple as that. Authenticity is about connection, communication, sensitivity, and curiosity. Authenticity is about human emotion, human relationships, and human empathy. Authenticity is the art of showing one's personhood, and performance is the art of putting all that into action. So given all this, all we now know about performance and authenticity and all that stuff, what's the answer? You know, what's the solution? Where's the WikiHow page with 7 steps to become my authentic self? You know, I'll take my 10 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy and do all my homework in the authentic self workbook, and I'll have it all figured out by the time we're all vaccinated. I hate to break it to you, but there really is no cut and dry answer for how to be authentic, at least judging by this analytic model. If anyone tells you that they can tell you how to be your authentic self, they're lying to you. And if anyone tells you there is actually a way to reach the goal line, to be authentic and just stop worrying about it for the rest of your life, they're also lying to you. This is a process that takes a lifetime and it needs constant monitoring. You never punch out of being yourself. Like you're never off the clock. Even me right now, like I'm on the clock. You're always you, which means that your reactions, your presentation, your awareness, your emotions, they're always being unveiled, concealed, reflected, and repressed. You could be alone watching the Great British Bake Off and you're still performing. You could be in a room full of strangers in a country where you don't even know the language and you could be authentic. It's really an all the time thing. And I know you'd love for me to tell you that there's an easy way to get there. Like if you just list in a journal all the defining roles in your life, mother, lawyer, spouse, self, and list the things you think about those roles next to the things you identify with in those roles, you can just solve all the problems with authenticity, check all those boxes. But sadly, that's not really how it works. I mean, it's a great place to start if you like journaling, but it's really not the end goal. The end goal is just for you to want to continue attempting to understand yourself, to comfortably perform your various roles and be polite and courteous at a cocktail party, rambunctious and drunk with your friends, professional and erudite at work, and never stop feeling like yourself. You know, never feel like you're putting on a face for others, even if you're bouncing between what my people call self states. This is something along the lines of what I tell mental health professionals, that in order to truly embody the experience of being a therapist, or the mise en scène of being a therapist, you've got to take into account all of the factors at play and amalgamate them into you. That's how you create an identity as a therapist, by discovering your own authenticity. But this can only happen after you pick apart each and every one of these aspects and find out what it means to you. And once you do that, bring them all together in a balanced and harmonic way. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to end up like the Dalai Lama if you figure out how to become authentic. In fact, you could learn that you're kind of a selfish jerk, which is totally fine. You know, as long as you've explored it enough to know that your meanness isn't a defense against hurt, or your selfishness isn't a defense against building dependency. And I think it was Socrates that said, know thyself. He really had the right idea. So now I'm going to open up the floor for questions, comments, anything.